back to Spinning Iris and another episode of Banned, Challenged, and Burned. Today's book is from a banned book, Repeat Offender. The first of at least 3 books to this author's name have been banned. This is a big one. Are you ready? Let's go. Of Mice and Men by American author John Steinbeck. Originally published in 1937, it was inspired by Steinbeck's own experience working as a migrant worker, and the title comes from a Robert Burns poem entitled To a Mouse. It tells the story of 2 men, 2 migrant workers on their way to a new job on a ranch in California. They are Lenny Small and George Milton. George is an intelligent man with a dream and a plan who's been traveling with Lenny and overall looking out for him. Lenny, while physically strong, is mentally different. He easily gets fixated on soft things and is mentally and emotionally more like a child. While things weren't great for them at the beginning, they do take a turn for the worse when they begin their new job. Things turn violent and rather tragic. This book is often used in schools as part of regular curriculum or suggested readings. It's one of the most banned books of the 20th century. It also tops many a top 10 list of banned books. It was number 6 on the American Library Association's most challenged books for the decades 1990 to 1999, as well as 2000 to 2009. It did take a dip in the 2010 to 2019 list as more offensive books began to appear. It slipped to number 28. However, for this past year, 2020, it ranked number 8 on the top 10 most challenged list. It can't even escape a pandemic. There are so many. It was banned in Ireland in 1953. That ban has since been lifted. However, this past year, there's been talk of removing Of Mice and Men and To Kill a Mockingbird from reading curriculum. Yeah. It was banned by clergy, it's been banned by various U.S. cities, challenged by parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers, banned and challenged by various schools and school boards through the 1970s up until this year. It's been banned by anti-socialists and people who just don't like Steinbeck or his beliefs. How about some specific ones? I'll do a few that stood out to me. In 1977, it was challenged in Greenville, South Carolina, by the 4th province of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah. In 1997, in Florida, a group called 100 Black United Inc. requested the novel's removal from Bay schools in Panama City. From last year, December 24th, it was in the news that a high school in Minnesota had instructed its teachers to stop teaching Of Mice and Men and another novel that I hadn't heard of. Vulgar and offensive language, including profanity and using God and Jesus blasphemously. Number 2, derogatory statements about African Americans, women, and the developmentally disabled. 3, indecent sexual overtones and lurid passages about sex. Number 4, promoting euthanasia. 5, morbid and depressing themes. 6, its violent ending. 7, social implications. 8, doesn't represent traditional values. 9, age inappropriate. And 10, John Steinbeck's anti-business attitude and questionable patriotism. That's a lot for a little book. Offensive language. There is profanity spread out throughout the book, just as there is profanity spread out throughout the real world from regular people. Too many instances to describe specifically. The bad words that get the most attention from challengers are the religious ones and the racist one. So I did an eyeball count of all the bad words. I may have missed a few. By my count, God is said 32 times. Damn is said 34 times, sometimes in a God combo. Jesus and or Christ is said 22 times. Hell is said 39 times. For some minor words, bastard is said 13 times, and bitch and even 10. Some of those are actually referring to a female dog. Of course, the most contentious word cited by challengers is the N-word. I counted it used 16 times. 7 of those are on a single page and spoken by one character, an ignorant old male farmhand, and it is used a few times by the character it is generally directed towards, a character named Crooks. And oh boy, when he uses it, you can practically hear the derision in his voice. So why use these words? Steinbeck could easily have left them out. But then you'd have unrealistic characters talking like properly educated, polite members of society, and not like real working men of the 1930s. Given the time, place, and occupation of the characters, it wouldn't make sense. This story isn't about being polite. It's about painting a realistic picture of a specific time and place. And it's honestly, the way it's written is one of the greatest things about it. It is written in what is described as dialect. Might be why some people call it vulgar. Dialect uses swear words, it uses slang, it doesn't use proper punctuation. It can often be annoying, it can also be rather entertaining when it's done correctly. And when it's used correctly, you can hear the characters' voices, making them more accessible and relatable. Do I wish the N-word were not in this book? Of course. It's an ugly word. Sadly, it's a word used commonly in the past and unfortunately still used today. And Steinbeck is kind of slapping you in the face with it, as if to say to the reader who uses that word, do you hear the garbage coming out of your mouth? And with Crooks, who is one of the smartest characters in the book, his use of it is more a way to bring about a point on how nonsensical and mean it is to use it. However, there is one more word in this story that perhaps doesn't get the attention it deserves. It certainly doesn't raise the ire of the easily offended. A rather mundane word. It is used far more often in this book than the typical swear words. Rabbits. By visual count, the word rabbits occurs 62 times in the text. Lenny almost shouted, "About the rabbits!" "You're nuts," said Crooks. "You're crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about?" "The rabbits we're gonna get, and I get to tend 'em, cut grass and give 'em water and like that." It is so offensive, I think I'll add it to my bank of everyday profanity. Rabbits. Number 2. Derogatory statements about African Americans, women, and the developmentally disabled. Primarily comes back to the use of the N-word, again, used against the character Crooks, as mentioned before. Most of the derogatory comments come from the one ranch hand character named Curly and Curly's wife, as well as the derisive things Crooks says about himself. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play because I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, all of you stink to me." Curly's wife is particularly hateful. Speaking of her, there are 2 types of women described in this book, the motherly types and the floozy type. Curly's wife is the only real physically present female represented in the book, and she's a floozy type. Not an actual character, more a character type, or rather a plot device. After all, she wasn't even given a name. Here's George talking to Lenny after they meet Curly's wife. "I seen 'em poisoned before, but I never seen no piece of jail bait worse than her. You leave her be." And then a little later on, George said, "She's gonna make a mess. Gonna be a bad mess about her. She's a jail bait all set on the trigger. That Curly got his work cut out for him." Ranch with a bunch of guys on it ain't no place for a girl, especially like her. Boy, is George dead on and calling her trouble. And that brings us to Lenny, representing the developmentally disabled. Lenny gets called dumb and crazy by just about everyone. What the complainers ignore, of course, is that most people, once they meet Lenny, they like him. And the scene at the end of where Lenny innocently invades Crooks's privacy, George asks Crooks, "Well, why didn't you kick him out?" "I didn't care much," said Crooks. "Lenny's a nice fella." Same chapter a moment before with regards to Crooks. Another ranch hand stands up for Crooks in, I guess, the best way he can, given the circumstances, against some of the horrible things that Curly's wife says to Crooks. He says, "If you was to do that, we'd tell," he said quietly. "We'd tell about you framing Crooks." Of course, it's the 1930s, and Curly's wife is a horrible example of a female character. And even she likes Lenny. And as horrible as she is just as miserable, just as lonely as the other male character and character types, with her own set of broken dreams. Indecent sexual overtones and lurid passages about sex. Really? I'm just going to say it. There is no sex in this book. None. We do have a couple sections where George is talking about what he could be doing if he didn't have to take care of Lenny. "I could get a job and work and no trouble. No mess at all, and when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go into town and get whatever I want. Why, I could stay in a cat house all night. I could eat any place I want, hotel or any place, and order any damn thing I could think of." George is contemplating. "You give me a good whore house every time," he said. "A guy can go in and get drunk and get everything out of his system all at once and no messes. And he knows how much it's going to set him back. These here jail baits is just set on the trigger of the hooskow." Then you have a passage of where one guy's talking to George about what the other hands do when they have some time off. A place they go to in town to have a good time. "Sure, come along, it's a lot of fun. Her cracking jokes all the time. Like she says one time, she says, 'I've knew people that if they got a ragged rug on the floor and a Cupid doll lamp on the phonograph, they think they're running a parlor house.' That's Clara's house she's talking about. And Susie says, 'I know what you boys want,' she says. 'My girls is clean,' she says. 'And there ain't no water in my whiskey,' she says. 'If any of you guys want to look at a Cupid doll lamp and take your own chance getting burned, why, you know where to go.' And she says, 'There's guys around here walking bow-legged 'cause they like to look at a Cupid doll lamp.'" It's not just about sex there. It's just another piece of the loneliness pie in this story. This particular place, this Susie's place, is not just a place to flop. It's a safe, clean place to drink in good company. And yeah, Curly's wife is a provocative character. She's not walking around naked, though. Maybe it's Curly's glove full of Vaseline that they're finding so sensational. The swamper warmed to his gossip. "You seen that glove on his left hand?" "Yeah, I seen it." "Well, that glove's full of Vaseline." "Vaseline? What the hell for?" "Well, I tell you what, Curly says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife." George studied the cards absorbedly. "That's a dirty thing to tell around," he said. Honestly, it's pretty tame compared to the books I've looked at so far. And it's probably going to be the most decent displays of sexuality in any of the banned books I'll ever read. Promoting euthanasia. The act or practice of killing or permitting death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals, such as persons or domestic animals, in a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. While George killing Lenny is a mercy killing, what George is basically doing is saving Lenny from what would have been a very painful and torturous murder by an actual crazy person bent on seeing Lenny suffer. The only true example of euthanasia in here would be with regards to Candy's very, very old dog. Carlson was not to be put off. "Look, Candy, this old dog just suffers hisself all the time. If you was to take him out and shoot him right in the back of the head," he leaned over and pointed, "right there, why, he'd never know what hit him." Candy looked about unhappily. "No," he said softly. "No, I couldn't do that. I had him too long." "He don't have no fun," Carlson insisted, "and he stinks to beat hell. Tell you what, I'll shoot him for you. Then it won't be you that does it." "I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog." These passages in context of the story are not really about euthanasia. They're more foreshadowing what will happen in the end, introducing a weapon, a motive, and a means for George to let go of Lenny with a justifiable, basically murder. 5. Morbid and depressing themes. Themes including loneliness, having dreams even if they're unfulfilled, and discrimination. Crook said gently, "Maybe you can see now. You got George. You know he's going to come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you got to read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him," he whined. "A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long's he's with you. I tell you," he cried, "I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick." Some other themes that, not quite so morbid. The other side to loneliness. Companionship, acceptance, kindness, and, much like Pandora's box, hope. Even if it's fleeting. Curly cried, "Sure, they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land, not much, just something that was his. Something he could live on and there couldn't nobody throw him off of it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops, and when I harvested 'em, it wasn't none of my harvest. But we gonna do it now, and don't you make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. That money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George, we gonna have a room to ourself. We're gonna have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're gonna have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat." He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Oh, rabbits! It's like reality. Number 6. The violent ending. Would this be George killing Lenny? Because that action is over and done with in a very short paragraph, with a build-up that is rather gentle and heartbreaking. And George raised the gun and steadied it, and he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. Lenny jarred, and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he laid without quivering. Or are they referring to the combination of Lenny accidentally killing Curly's wife, building up to Lenny being killed? Just back to realism. Imagine how violent it would have been had Curly gotten hold of Lenny before George. Number 7. Social implications. Let's see. Self-sufficiency, self-isolation, ageism, sexism, discrimination. Wondering if it comes back to the use of the N-word again. If the challengers think that teens seeing this word used in a book are going to go ahead and think it's okay to use it in their everyday way of speaking. Ignoring, of course, that some of these young people have already been acquainted with this word, whether it's from certain members of their family, or certain songs from popular musical artists, or other books that they've read. Perhaps the challenging parents don't want to have to explain their own prejudices to their children, or want to have their prejudices exposed. So all these lovely social issues are being represented and presented in this novel for interesting discussion, not only in regards to historical context, but also with regards to society today. Oh, rabbits. Young people talking about hard things. Oh, the humanity. Number 8. Doesn't represent traditional values. I should hope not. This is probably one of the weirder ones on the list. Traditional values are not represented in this novel in any traditional way, because that's not what this story is about. This would be a completely different story if it were. You have a group of men in 1930s Depression-era America working from job to job, literal back-breaking work, just to survive. Perhaps this challenger was reading too much into Lenny and George's relationship. This is realism, not tradition. Now, there is a character I haven't mentioned yet. His name is Slim. He is a man of confidence, grace, strength, and intelligence. Lenny, who had been following the conversation back and forth with his eyes, smiled complacently at the compliment. Slim looked approvingly at George for having given the compliment. He leaned over the table and snapped the corner of a loose card. "You guys travel around together?" His tone was friendly. It invited confidence without demanding it. "Sure," said George. "We kind of look after each other." He indicated Lenny with his thumb. "He ain't bright. Hell of a good worker, though. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. I've knew him for a long time." Slim looked through George and beyond him. "Ain't many guys travel around together," he mused. "I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. He doesn't waste word or action. Everybody likes and respects him. Want a traditional character? There he is. Also, they don't work on Sundays. That used to be traditional." Number 9. Inappropriate for age group. Well, this book is typically taught to either middle schoolers or high schoolers. I guess it depends on the area. Of Mice and Men is easy to read. It is interesting. It is down to earth. The themes are relevant to teenagers, and with historical context and thoughtful teachers discussing with students some of the more delicate or sensitive topics, this is absolutely age appropriate. Number 10. Steinbeck's Anti-Business Attitude and Questionable Patriotism. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I have a feeling this complaint is going to come back around when I finally get to Steinbeck's other greatly challenged and banned novel, The Grapes of Wrath, where this complaint stems from. As Steinbeck did draw influence from his own experience to write of Mice and Men, he would have first-hand account of the practices of big farm businesses. As for questionable patriotism, that particular challenge I saw was rather old and primarily based on the fact that Steinbeck was part of a writing group called the League of American Writers, which was a communist organization that existed between the 1930s and 1940s. And that also included authors Ernest Hemingway, Lillian Hellman, and Langston Hughes, to name a few. Forgetting, of course, Steinbeck did work as a correspondent during World War II, even saw some action apparently, as well as some war correspondence during the Vietnam War. And we can forgive that challenger for not knowing about John Steinbeck's involvement and work with the CIA. That information was not disclosed until 2012, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act and a curious researcher. In most cases of the challenges and removals of the book, they were overturned and the book reinstated to their respective school. Alternative titles were available to students who were not allowed to participate, including John Steinbeck's short story, The Pearl. And in one particular case, 2 other novels were offered, The House on Mango Street and The Way to Rainy Mountain. In all cases, it was students and teachers and scholars who came out to defend Of Mice and Men at public hearings, of course, as it usually is. People who actually read the book in its entirety, not in bits and pieces. There's no news as of yet on the status of the 2 most recent instances of challenges that I've heard. Of course, the best backlash of all is how readily available the story itself is, and also in how many different forms. Not just the novel, it's been adapted to plays, even an opera, and audiobooks, audio dramas, and at least 13 filmed versions in multiple languages. In fact, it was John Steinbeck's first novel to be adapted for the big screen back in 1939. Pretty rabbiting good for a banned book. As for author response, I couldn't readily find anything specifically from John Steinbeck about any censorship for Of Mice and Men. He did die in 1968, and most of recorded instances that I could find for challenges occurred in the 70s, so it'd be understandable not to find anything specific there. But I will end this section with an apt quote from another novel that I'll eventually get to on this list. "There is more beauty in truth, even if it is a dreadful beauty." With all these complaints, why do people still want to teach of mice and men? Should it still be taught? I know there are probably teachers out there who don't want to teach it. They have their reasons. Hopefully they're intellectual and not emotional. I get it. I understand why some people don't like this novel. Some of the language is difficult to read. It's a shame certain words are still in use, whether historically or currently. They want something different with a similar message, something more modern that their students can connect with, something safe. And I'm certain there are worthy novels out there similar to Of Mice and Men, just waiting to be picked up. Although, perhaps there is something about Of Mice and Men that sticks out, and it might be one of the reasons why it is still being taught. And that has to do with one of the main characters belonging to an underrepresented book in literature and popular media. Lenny, the mentally different, the developmentally disabled. How many worthy books are there with sympathetic characters like him? Not enough. We do want people to be exposed to a wide range of different characters, right? Well, at least there is an alternative Steinbeck short story that many students are exposed to. The Pearl. That's the one I got in middle school. Yes, I wasn't happily traumatized by a story about a hard-working man mercy killing his best friend, destroying his future plans, dreams, and hopes. No. Instead, I was happily traumatized by a story about a hard-working man who accidentally gets his baby killed, destroying his dreams, his plans, his hopes for the future. All the trauma of a discriminatory world, minus the profanity. Of Mice and Men is an easy target, and I have a feeling it is going to be continued to be a challenged and banned book for the foreseeable future. And bibliophiles and Steinbeck fans will rejoice in its message and its infamy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, did you read Of Mice and Men in middle school or high school? If you didn't, what alternative did you get? Do you think this book deserves to be one of the most challenged and banned books of the last 100 years? Man. What to read next? This is going to be a tough one to follow up. Anyway, in the meantime, take care. Bye-bye.